I have to say the one thing I disagree with Jeff about is that it was not a great personal sacrifice of me to come here. So far I'm enjoying it very much. I'm very glad I came. I'm enjoying both being in this beautiful place and meeting the people here. And I'm looking forward to spending some time discussing important matters with some very interesting people. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm glad you're here too. I was told that I had a certain amount of time to talk, despite the fact that I'm in one of those professions that you only enter when you like to hear yourself talk at great length. I thought I think that, first of all, nobody can actually stand to listen to more than about, at the most, 45 minutes of blather from somebody before they begin fading out. And also, that gives us more time to have a discussion and to have questions. So, partly because I wanted to not just wander on and on, I'm doing something which I don't entirely approve of, which is reading a text, because I have a lot of things I want to say. I want to say them coherently, and I want to say them in as short an amount of time as possible. So please forgive me for reading to you. And that said, I'll start. 2 years ago, I wrote a book, Business as Usual, about the current state of the world economy. By the time it came out, a year later, the official word from the National Bureau of Economic Research was that the recession that had officially begun in 2008 was over. And it was confidently asserted by economists, politicians, and financial pundits that recovery was well underway. In the last few months, however, to select only a few phrases from articles in the New York Times, and these are mostly quotations, economists were stunned by the failure of the economy to expand. Zero job growth in the United States is, it was said, a signal that the economy is stalled and that inaction by policymakers carries substantial risk. And the Eurozone staggers from one moment of sovereign debt crisis to another, weakly threatening the health of the global financial system, while American cities and states threaten bankruptcy, cancel pension plans, or cut unemployment benefits, and lay off public workers in droves for lack of funds. The forecast in Tuesday's Times: slower economic growth throughout Europe, and probably in the United States. Huge losses by major European banks. Declining stock markets worldwide. This morning's stock ticker will confirm that. A tightening of credit, making it harder for many borrowers to get loans. Preoccupied with simply trying to follow what's going on, economists seem to largely have given up trying to explain it. I have to say that I, in contrast, was not at all stunned by this turn of affairs. Though I certainly don't enjoy events as they are unfolding, I have the bitter satisfaction of seeing the picture I drew in my book of the state of the economic system confirmed. This is not because I am smarter than everybody else, or because I have access to secret information. It's really only because I look at the economy without the assumptions common to most schools of economic thought. Above all, the basic assumption that the natural state of economic life is one of balanced growth. For economics, as it has developed as a field since the 17th century, the capitalist market economy is basically a mechanism for allocating resources to produce goods to meet human needs. It can therefore only be non-economic factors, natural disasters, human psychology, or mistaken government policies that disrupt the normal problem-solving processes of the economy and produce crises and depressions. Left alone, all will be well. Thus, the report issued by the official Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission in January 2011, after a year and a half of research and testimony of academics and other economic experts, came up with no more than the idea, already conventional wisdom, that the economic downturn of 2008 might have been avoided, having been caused by a combination of lax governmental regulation and excessive risk-taking by lenders and borrowers, particularly in the housing market. It was the same conventional wisdom that assured us that swift government action prevented the Great Recession from turning into a full-blown depression, and that the downturn had given way to recovery. I did not find this convincing then, and I doubt that you will find it convincing now. Why was the recovery so fragile? Why is unemployment stubbornly high? Why are the banks, newly stocked with cash by that swift government action, so uninterested in advancing it for business expansion? Why is the series of sovereign debt crises in Europe, and coming in China, as provincial debt-fueled bubbles collapse, echoed in the US by shrinking state budgets? Why do politicians call relentlessly for austerity, even while the economy remains unable to satisfy the need of millions for housing, healthcare, education, and even food? The bankruptcy of the putative science of economics, already demonstrated by the failure of experts to predict the catastrophe, is underlined by their apparent inability either to explain what is happening at present or to reach consensus on measures to be taken in response. In the face of continuing economic stagnation, economic analysts are in fact not much better than the global warming skeptics who insist that all is well, despite the spreading drought, wildfires, I wish it were wildflowers, wildfires, floods, melting glaciers, and marauding tornadoes. A remarkable feature of most of the commentary on today's economic troubles is that, despite constant reference to the Great Depression of the 1930s, as well as to the many downturns since World War II, there has been, as Jeff pointed out earlier, little mention of the fact that business depressions have been a recurrent feature of the capitalist economy since the Industrial Revolution. But even the briefest attention to history makes recent events appear far from unusual. From the early 1800s to the late 1930s, in fact, capitalism spent between a third and a half of its history in depressions, depending on how they are dated by different authorities, which increased steadily in seriousness up to the big one in 1929. It was only the relative shallowness of the recessions since World War II that gave new life to the idea, already promoted at the start of capitalism's history by early enthusiasts like David Ricardo and Jean-Baptiste Say, that capitalism would no longer undergo the ups and downs characteristic of its first 150 years as the dominant social form. The choice in economics theory after the war seemed to be between the neoliberal idea of capitalism as a self-equilibrating system and the Keynesian conception of the economy as controllable by government manipulation. The inadequacy of both views, demonstrated by current economic events, as well as by the economic history of the last 40 years, calls for another look at the long-term dynamic of the capitalist system. Early students of what, by the later 19th century, had come to be called the business cycle, or as they called it then, the trade cycle in English, came to understand it as characteristic of a market economy, in which most goods are produced for sale. In such an economy, the reason goods and services are produced by businesses is to make money. Businesses expand and contract and move from producing one kind of good or service to another in response to the level of profits earned by their investments. By the early 20th century, statistical studies, carried out most importantly by the American economist Wesley Mitchell and his National Bureau for Economic Research, the same outfit that does the official recession dating today, demonstrated that the alternation of prosperity and depression closely followed the fluctuations of business profitability. It's nice to have this demonstrated, but common sense will tell you the same things. It's clearly, people don't expand businesses if they're not making money. And in fact, if they're not making money, they tend to contract their businesses. The most elaborately worked out explanation of these fluctuations, Karl Marx's theory of the profit rate, came from so far outside the mainstream of economic theory as to be largely ignored by students of capitalism, including most on the left. But economic history suggests the accuracy of Marx's idea that while prosperity creates conditions for an eventual crisis, the ensuing depression makes possible an economic revival. I should say this is not peculiarly Marx's idea that pattern was taken up by other thinkers after Marx. And particularly in the United States, probably the most interesting people to try to figure out this pattern were Thorstein Veblen, whose student was Wesley Mitchell. Mitchell became interested in the business cycle as an attempt to prove the correctness of Veblen's theory of depression and prosperity. How does the Depression make possible an economic revival? By lowering investment costs, thanks to bankruptcies, price collapses, the vaporization of paper claims to investment income, and the decline of labor costs, due both to increased unemployment and the improved productivity of new machinery. All of this brings higher rates of return on investment, producing increased investment and an expanding economy. Despite its peculiar features, the Great Depression and the post-1945 revival of the global capitalist economy followed in broad outline the pattern set in previous episodes of economic crisis and regeneration. The Depression was a very long one, and the level of physical and economic destruction was unusually high. I'd like that. It's a very good sound. Destruction of capital goods. Thank you. Unusually high. Am I doing that? You know what? Let me just move this away from the tie. Maybe it's objecting to the wildflowers. It's not surprising, therefore, that the revival led to a period of prosperity, lasting until the mid-1970s, that economists dubbed the Golden Age for its length and amplitude. The relative freedom from serious downturns during these years was due also to the continuation into the post-Depression period, and this is a very important part of the story, of what had come to be called Keynesian methods. Government spending as a percentage of GDP in the OECD countries, that's to say the big advanced capitalist, industrial capitalist nations, increased from 27% in 1950 to 37% in 1973. In the US, as political economist Joyce Kolko noted in 1988, roughly half of all new employment after 1950 was created by state expenditures, and a comparable shift occurred in the other OECD nations. Keynes's idea had been that the government would borrow money in times of depression to get the economy moving again, because he shared the normal economist assumption that the economy naturally expanded, and it was just some strange non-economic phenomena that blocked that expansion. So once you sort of primed the pump, then the water of economic growth is supposed to flow freely. When national income expanded in response, it could then be harmlessly taxed to pay back the debt. In reality, crisis management turned into a permanent state-private mixed economy. The debt was never paid back. When the Golden Age came to a definitive end in the mid-1970s, the massive increase in government spending that avoided a return to Depression conditions then was another step on the way to today's increasingly problematic deficits. The very reason for the increase in government spending, insufficient private business profits, made it impossible to pay off the resulting state debt. Meanwhile, government debt was joined by soaring amounts of corporate and private debt, making possible the apparent prosperity of the last 2 decades. Promises to pay sometime in the future took the place of the money the slowing capitalist economy failed to generate. Since governments, businesses, and to an ever-increasing degree, individuals used borrowed funds to purchase goods and services, public, corporate, and household debt appeared on bank and other business balance sheets as profits. But the repayment of debt requires money made by the profitable production and sale of goods and services. And, as UCLA history professor Robert Brenner observes, I quote, "Between 1973 and the present, economic performance in the US, Western Europe, and Japan has, by every standard macroeconomic indicator, deteriorated business cycle by business cycle, decade by decade, with the exception of the second half of the 1990s, which, of course, had the great bubbles that led up to the collapse of 2007. Equally telling, over the same period, capital investment in a world scale and in every region besides China, even including the East Asian newly industrializing countries, since the middle 1990s, has grown steadily weaker. The result was, roughly, the reappearance in 2007 of the depression avoided in the 1970s. Of course, the limits of the post-1970s expansion were there to be seen all along. In the mounting unredeemable debt of Latin America and Eastern Europe, in the millions of unemployable human beings accumulating in the slums of Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, as well as in the former Soviet Union and its satellites, now liberated into the embrace of the free market. And we're talking about 40% unemployment in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. According to the United Nations Human Development Report for 2004, I quote, "An unprecedented number of countries saw development slide backwards in the 1990s. In 46 countries, people are poorer today than in 1990. In 25 countries, more people are hungry today than a decade ago." In 2010, the specter of mass poverty became inescapable in the richest nations as well. A new Japanese government acknowledged an official 16% poverty rate, and that fallen global number 2, while growing rates of poverty, hunger, and homelessness in the United States demonstrated, or would have if anyone had been interested, the utter failure of the war on poverty fought in the waning years of the Golden Age. But such phenomena seemed, as they still seem, incomprehensible elements of paradox, given the business cycle-inflected growth of GDP and the growing wealth of the minority at the top. Thus, Nobel laureate economist Paul Krugman, noting what he called a remarkable disconnect between overall economic growth and the economic fortunes of most American families in 2005, found this impossible to explain and pronounced it simply, these are his words, a mystery. But it is only a mystery if we ignore the centrality of profit-making to the capitalist economy and the origin of profit and the productive work performed by the employees of businesses beyond the quantity needed for their own reproduction. As far from the observable facts of economic life, the numbers reported by economic specialists and journalists, as these considerations are, they are all too well confirmed by recent decades of low investment growth, testifying to insufficient levels of business profit. In other words, there's lots of profit. Like even right now, in the last week, corporate profits are up by I think 12%. But even though there's lots of money, it's not enough to generate the level of investment necessary to actually employ the 9 billion people in the world. If in the past, it was depression itself that by cheapening the costs of capital investment made possible a revival in profit rates, and so renewed prosperity, it is not surprising that the debt-fueled postponement of depression should lead to stagnation outside of the kingdom of debt, the financial sector itself. And even here, avoiding collapse has required continued infusions of government money. If this way of looking at the economy's workings is correct, and the whole earlier history of capitalism suggests that it is, there can be no real solution to the difficulties so dramatically manifested since 2007, other than the deep depression whose avoidance has been the main goal of economic policy for the last 40 years. When the collapse of the great American mortgage bubble in 2007 set off a global crisis, national governments found themselves caught between the need to keep the system functioning by pouring money into financial firms too big to fail, supporting local governments and stimulating the private economy, and the imperative to limit the growth of state debt before it reached the point of large-scale default. The United States had a government debt of $16 billion in 1930. Today it is $14 trillion and climbing. The federal debt had already reached nearly 40% of GDP by 1970. It was at 64% in 2004, when the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, warned that the combination of America's budget deficit and its ballooning trade imbalance threatened the financial stability of the global economy. It is the looming possibility of that risk, no matter how distant it remains at present, that keeps even those not ready to give up completely on stimulus spending, like the current US and Japanese governments, and even, as we learned a few days ago, the IMF itself, modest in their Keynesian ambitions, simply hoping, bolstered by the psychic predictions of economists, that it will all be over in a year or two and everything will be okay again. In their hesitation between the rock of ongoing depression, with its dangers of social upheaval, and the hard place of stimulus spending, with its limited effectiveness and disastrously mounting deficits, governments seek a point of balance between their function of preserving what social theorists call social cohesion, in other words, people not rioting the streets and burning down banks, and their fundamental orientation to the needs and wishes of business. Here in the United States, the Treasury Department's unwillingness to interfere seriously with bankers' decision-making about the funds shoveled in their direction. Hence the seeming schizophrenia of Obama's statement to reporters in March 2009 that we've got to see worldwide action to make sure that the contraction in demand, consumer spending, is dealt with, while at the same moment signaling to Congress that he was in favor of taxing employee health benefits, thus decreasing wages and contracting demand. Hence the unwillingness of European governments to follow the Americans very far down even this half-hearted road, leaving the stimulus exercise to the United States, while concentrating on limiting their budget deficits and tightening their citizens' belts. If simply allowing the economy to collapse into depression, as some ultra-neoliberal economists seemingly urge, is one unacceptable alternative, the other is to increase the economic activity of the state to a radical degree. American government, federal, state, and local, is already responsible for about 35% of GDP. So you could say America is about 65% a capitalist country. Already 35% of it is non-profit government economy. When this number hit 50% at the height of the Second World War, the growth of private capital came more or less to a halt. State sector growth today would mean a similar displacement of capitalist enterprise to create a state-run economy like that of the old Soviet Union, a goal favored by no political force. It's only 20 years since Russia and its satellites embraced the free market, or some highly weird and restricted version of it. But those governments show no interest in returning to the centrally planned system of yore. The Chinese state, too, has clearly thrown in its lot with the market. And even Sweden, long the Western standard bearer for socialism in the eyes of American conservatives, refused to take over Saab from General Motors, with the announcement from Enterprise Minister Maud Olofsson that, I quote, "the Swedish state is not prepared to own car factories." Everywhere, most stimulus money is meant to be pumped into the private economy as income transfers, tax cuts, or government payments and subsidies to business. As I observed at the start of this talk, from the ahistorical viewpoint of economics, the point of an economy is the allocation of resources to meet consumption needs. The chief issue distinguishing conflicting viewpoints on economic policy, then, is what sort of economy, what mix, for example, of the market and state planning, does the best job of promoting the public welfare, or as it was once called, the wealth of nations. This is why most economists, including Keynes, have thought of profit-making as a device for getting people with money to invest in the production that serves consumption. And this is what allows a contemporary Keynesian like Paul Krugman to ignore the imperative of profitability and insist in making an argument for a massive stimulus program that, I quote, "under current conditions, a surge in public spending would employ Americans who would otherwise be unemployed and money that would otherwise be sitting idle, and put both to work, producing something useful." But capitalism is not a system for producing employment as an abstract goal, but for employing people who produce profits. Its goal is not the production of useful things, but the increase of capital wealth. It is only an illusion embodied in the allied concepts of national income and economic growth that the health of capitalism consists in anything other than the growth of profits and so of capital investment. While neither economists nor businessmen have an adequate theoretical understanding of their system, the latter, business people, at least have a practical sense of how it works. Business people, however much they may claim that their activities ultimately are for the general good, know that profit itself, not the consumption of the public, is the goal of business. They can see that government-provided payments for old age pensions, health care, and unemployment relief represent increases in workers' incomes, not businesses' income, and that the growing government debt will at some point have to be repaid, while in the meantime absorbing money that might have gone into business investment, whether or not, in fact, businesses are eager to invest it, but in any case can go into business people's pockets. They feel, without fully comprehending, the fundamental conflict between the private enterprise economy and the government spending on which it has come to rely. Broadus Mitchells, a great economic historian, made some remarks about the opposition in the United States to the public debt that fueled the New Deal. These remarks apply equally to the deficit hawks of today, when anxiety is no more warranted by the immediate threat of fiscal insolvency than it was in the 1930s. Broadus Mitchell wrote, "There's every reason to believe that the real protest of the deficit hawks of the 30s was not fiscal, but broadly economic and political in character. The true fear was that government intervening in the crisis would weaken the claims of the system of private enterprise. What began as a succor to private business threatened to supplant it." The underlying problem is that government-financed production does not produce profit. This is hard to grasp, not only because it contradicts a basic presupposition of the past 75 years of economic policy, that government spending can function as an equivalent of private capitalist investment, but because a company that sells goods to the state, as when Boeing provides bombers for the Air Force, does receive a profit, and usually a good one, on its investment. But the money paid to Boeing represents a deduction from the profit produced by the economy as a whole. For the government has no money of its own. It pays with tax money, or with borrowed funds that will eventually have to be repaid out of taxes. Tax money appears to be paid by everyone, but despite the appearance that business is undertaxed, only business actually pays taxes. To understand this paradoxical fact, remember that the total income produced in a year is the money available for all purposes. Some of this money must go to replace producers' goods, machinery, raw materials, used up in the previous year. Some must go in the form of wages to buy consumer goods so that the labor force can reproduce itself. The rest appears as profit, interest, rent, and taxes. The money workers actually get is their, as you know perfectly well, is their after-tax income. From this perspective, tax increases on employee income are just a way of lowering wages. The money deducted from paychecks, as well as from dividends, capital gains, and other forms of business income, could appear as business profits, which, let us remember, is basically the money generated by workers' activity that they do not receive as wages, if it didn't flow through paychecks or other income into government coffers. So when the government buys goods or services from a corporation, or simpler yet, hands agribusiness a subsidy or a bank a bailout, it is just giving a portion of its cut of profits back to business, collecting it from all and giving it to some. The money paid to Boeing has simply been redistributed by the state from other businesses to the aircraft producer. The important point of all this is that government spending cannot solve the problem of depression, because the problem is not insufficient consumer demand, but insufficient profits for business expansion, which in turn determines the extent of consumer demand by determining the degree of employment. It can put off the issue by supplying financial and other businesses with the money they need to continue operations. It can also alleviate the suffering it causes, at least in the short run, by providing jobs or money to those out of work. It can create infrastructure useful for future profitable production. Beyond that, the main service rendered to the industrial capitalist system by the state, as the German political sociologist Martin Jennecke ironically wrote, is to serve as a scapegoat. While it is the entrepreneurs and managers who make the decisions, the state is blamed for failures in the economy, from inflation to unemployment. And the parties involved in the game of changing of the guards play it in all seriousness. So, as though Obama was responsible for the employment rate, any more than he will be, or the next character who occupies his office will be responsible for either an increase, a decrease, or stagnation of the unemployment rate in the future. There is actually very little that governments can do about this. The underlying problem in a period of depression can be solved only by the depression itself, perhaps aided, as on the last important occasion, by a large-scale war, which is a real role for the state, which can raise profitability by lowering capital and labor costs, increasing productivity through technological advances, and concentrating capital ownership in larger, more efficient units. This is why the recurrent application of stimulus since the Second World War could provide an ever-weakening simulacrum of prosperity, only at the cost of a rising accumulation of debt. It is also why debt cannot expand indefinitely without either undermining the variability of governments to function via the growing domination of budgets by interest charges, or diminishing the already insufficient profitability of private enterprise. This is why politicians were already turning, by mid-2010, from moderate stimulus policies to austerity, cutting government employment, unemployment relief, healthcare, pensions, and everything else within reach. The worldwide calls of businessmen and politicians for cuts in public spending, however exaggerated by neoliberal ideology, thus represent recognition of a post-30s novelty, the fact that the Keynesian card has largely been played. The money has already been spent. Even aside from the problems inherent in growing state deficits, it is as hard today as in the past to imagine how further infusions of government debt, aside from helping out the occasional deserving millionaire, would be able to save the world economy. What will the financiers invest in as they become solvent again? This is the big question that is neither asked nor answered. So far, the chief option seems to be, besides the financial products of yesterday's bubble economy, the bonds representing governments' growing and unredeemable debt. So the big target of funds investment, bank funds investment in the last 2 years has been Greek government bonds. If debt expansion for purposes of speculation could bring prosperity, we'd already be living in a new golden age. Similarly, the re-regulation of finance, touted by government and pundits as a protective against future financial crises, even if it goes beyond the narrow limits that seem the likely outcome of the current political brouhaha, will not solve the problem of claims on investment income far exceeding the actual money flowing to meet them, any more than pouring more freshly printed dollars into the bank vault's will. Although today's capitalism is in many ways a much transformed version of its 19th century self, this transformation has not brought an abatement of the systemic problems diagnosed by its critics in that century. It presents them instead in new forms. In fact, I think, the crisis looming before us is likely to be, if anything, more terrible than the Great Depressions of 1873 to 93 and 1929 to 39. The continuing industrialization of agriculture and urbanization of population. By 2010, it is estimated more than half of the Earth's population lives in cities for the first time in history, has made more and more people dependent on the market to supply them with food and other necessities of life. The existence in or over the edge of survival experienced today by the urban masses of Cairo, Dhaka, Sao Paulo, and Mexico City will be echoed in the capitalistically advanced nations as unemployment and government-dictated austerity afflict more and more people, not just in the developed world's rust belts, but in New York, Los Angeles, London, Madrid, and Prague. Left to its own devices, capitalism promises economic difficulties for decades to come, with increased assaults on the earnings and working conditions of those who are still lucky enough to be wage earners around the world, waves of bankruptcies and business consolidations for capitalist firms, and increasingly serious conflicts among economic entities and even nations over just who is going to pay for all this. Which automobile companies in which countries will survive while others take over their assets and markets? Which financial institutions will be crushed by uncollectible debts? Which will survive to take over larger chunks of the world market for money? What struggles will develop for the control of raw materials, such as oil, or water for irrigation, or drinking, or agricultural land? All governments attack protectionism today, at least they did yesterday, and call for mutual support and free trade. But in practice, even a relatively integrated economic union like Europe is breaking down under the strain of divergent interests, while yesteryear's globalist cheerleaders today solemnly intone the need to buy American, something which is actually impossible to do. Capitalism exists today as a world system to an unprecedented degree, especially since the breakup of the Soviet Empire and the integration of the formerly centrally planned economies into the world market. Largely escaping the control of national governments, massive flows of money for both investment and speculative purposes link the fate of national economies. While this has strengthened capitalism as a system, internationally minded, given its basis in the drive to expand money holdings by any means possible, it also means that serious problems for the system's institutions are rapidly transmitted around the globe. Any solutions to the difficulties capitalism creates for itself will likewise have to be international. War is the traditional means to find such solutions. Will the world's people be willing to march off to war again, as in the last great crises, to secure better terms for national business interests? Europeans, whatever their governments may be planning, show every sign of having finally learned their lesson in this regard. While the American popular acquiescence in war seems to have been weakened by the series of defeats and stalemates suffered in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, and soon to be experienced in Afghanistan. Nonetheless, war continues to be a daily fact of contemporary capitalism, accounting for a major part of government budgets, and in one way or another, shaping the economic, social, and political existence of the global population. Gloomy though such considerations are, they leave out two paradoxically related factors which promise further dire effects for the future of capitalism. The possible coming decline of oil, the basis of the whole industrial system at present, as a source of energy, and the global warming caused by the consumption of fossil fuels. The second of these is certainly the more pressing concern. Even if continuing stagnation should slow greenhouse gas-caused climate change, the damage already done, and which is continuing to be done on a daily scale, is extremely serious. Elizabeth Kolbert, a journalist not given to exaggeration, called her soberly informative book on the topic Field Notes from a Catastrophe. The melting of glaciers threatens not only Swiss views, but the drinking supplies of whole populations in areas like Pakistan and the Andean watershed. Droughts have ravaged Australian and Chinese agriculture for years, not to mention Central Africa, while floods periodically devastate the low-lying South Asian homes of tens of millions of people. The rolling parade of disasters is unfortunately only getting started. It will accompany a stagnant economy and only be exacerbated by the increased greenhouse gas emissions a return to prosperity would bring. What both of these ongoing social stresses promise is that the decline of the economy, however cyclically inflected, will simply be the lead-in to a crisis of the social system as such, that, because it is based on the laws of physics and chemistry, will transcend strictly economic issues. If the peaking of oil supplies and the catastrophes of climate change do not provoke a major transformation of social life, it's hard to imagine what could. This idea may seem unreal today to those of us who still live, for the most part, in what remains of the material prosperity wrought by post-war capitalism, much as the misery and terror of the inhabitants of war-torn Congo, where 3 million people have been killed in the last few years, is hard to grasp for the inhabitants of New York or Buenos Aires. But this demonstrates only imagination's weakness, not the unreality of the challenges in store for us, as local disasters like the flood of oil that poured from BP's drilling rig into the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago will perhaps make it easier to understand. The biggest unknown in contemplating the future of capitalism is the tolerance of the world's population for the havoc that this social system's difficulties will inflict on their lives. How many people will have to lose health care? How many old people will have to be on the street looking for cat food cans in the garbage before people begin to get upset? It's hard to know. That people are able to react constructively in the face of the breakdown of normal patterns of social life, improvising solutions to immediate problems of physical and emotional survival, is amply demonstrated by their behavior in the face of disasters like earthquakes, floods, and wartime devastation, as well as in earlier periods of economic distress. Charles Fritz, who as captain in the US Army was stationed in Britain during World War II, studied the reactions of German civilians to the terror bombing of German cities by the Allies, and in 1950 became director of the University of Delaware's Disaster Research Project. In his writings, I mention him because he's one of the few people who's actually tried to study this question empirically and systematically. Fritz emphasized the socially and psychologically positive reaction of people to disasters, observing that, I quote, "the widespread sharing of danger, loss, and deprivation produces an intimate, primarily group solidarity among the survivors, which overcomes social isolation, provides a channel for intimate communication and expression, and provides a major source of physical and emotional support and reassurance. Disaster provides a form of societal shock which disrupts habitual, institutionalized patterns of behavior and renders people amenable to social and personal change." Observing that the traditional contrast between normal and disaster almost always ignores or minimizes the recurrent stresses of everyday life. I'll give you one interesting example of what that could mean. A friend of mine have done actually a couple of friends of mine have done very big studies of the relationship between mortality statistics in major industrial countries such as the United States to business cycle statistics. And they come up with the very striking result that periods of prosperity produce increases in the mortality rate. Periods of depression produce decreases in the mortality rate. There's also a guy who works for the National Science Foundation in Georgia who's done similar work. Why this paradoxical result? Because the thing that actually kills people the most consistently is having a full-time job. So as soon as unemployment numbers go up in depressions, human health improves almost immediately. One of the amazing results, my friend who studied the data, and he studied Spain, Sweden, and the United States, and a fascinating American result was already by 1930, mortality rates among African American men had fallen by something like 10%, simply because they were the first to be fired. So their health immediately improved. There's a slight rise in deaths during depressions as people get depressed and commit suicide. So there's a slight increase in suicide rates, but it's far overcome by the enormous change in, for one thing, people have less money, so they smoke less and they drink less. But the main thing is the stress of having a job. So I just give that as one example of what Fritz might have in mind by the recurrent stresses of everyday life. Fritz recognized a historically consistent and continually growing body of political and social analyses that point to the failure of modern societies to fulfill an individual's basic human needs for community identity. That 21st century people have lost neither the need nor the capacity to confront social authorities in defense of their interests has been demonstrated by protesting young people in Athens, striking government workers in Johannesburg, and most recently and spectacularly by the Egyptians, who, at least for a moment, destroyed a long-lived police state. People are, in any case, going to have adequate opportunity to explore such possibilities in the near future, if they wish to better their conditions of life in the concrete ways an unraveling economy will require. While at present they are still awaiting the promised return of prosperity, At some point, the newly homeless millions, like many of their predecessors in the 1930s, may well look at newly foreclosed empty houses, unsaleable consumer goods, and stockpiled government foodstuffs, and see the materials they need to sustain life. The simple taking and use of housing, food, and other goods, however, by breaking the rules of an economic system based on the exchange of goods for money, in itself already implies a radically new mode of social existence. The social relation between employers and wage earners, one that joins mutual dependence to inherent conflict, has become basic to all the world's nations. It will decisively shape the ways in which the future is experienced and responded to. No doubt, as in the past, workers will demand that industry or governments provide them with jobs. But if the former could profitably employ more people, they would already be doing so, while the latter, the governments, are even now coming up against the limits of sovereign debt. As unemployment continues to expand, perhaps it will occur to people with and without jobs that factories, offices, farms, schools, and other workplaces will still exist, even if they cannot be run profitably, and can be set into motion to produce goods and services that people need. Even if there are not enough jobs, paid employment, working for business or the state, there is plenty of work to be done if people organize production and distribution for themselves outside the constraints of the business economy. This would mean, of course, the destruction of the present social order and the construction of a new form of society, which is a rather big project. It was precisely this policy, this possibility, that is off limits for most contemporary social thought. The position was visible in its simplest dimensions in an op-ed article written for the New York Times in late March of this year by Matthew Klein, a research associate for the Council of Foreign Relations. I was very struck by this article. Observing that the recent militancy of Arab youth has been explained by their high unemployment and frustration with out-of-touch elites, Klein asserts, as a 24-year-old American, I can testify that this rich democracy, American, shares these features. If a quarter of Egyptian workers under 25 are unemployed, the US rate for workers 16 to 24 is a hefty 21%. But even while warning, and we just learned from government statistics a few days ago that something like 50% of workers between 25 and 35 make sub-poverty incomes. So Klein, while warning the developed world that what happened in Egypt could happen to you, he immediately withdrew from that and concluded that, of course, he said, an Egyptian-style revolution breaking out in a rich democracy is unthinkable. As I was writing this text, however, I discovered, to take only one example from many on offer, the following factoid. I quote, since the very end of March, there have been increasing amounts of schools occupations throughout France, provoked by the suppression of nearly 16,000 teachers' jobs, the closure of classes, the threatened closure of some of these schools, and the consequent increases in class sizes. Starting off with just a 3-hour occupation at the end of March in an infant school in a village called Carnival, south of Brest in the northwest, this has spread throughout the country with all-night occupations lasting several days, often with parties, barbecues, and the parents sleeping in tents on the playgrounds. Sarkozy has not been driven from the Élysée Palace, but such phenomena are signs, perhaps, that if those whose business it is to understand society are not allowed by their professions to do so, others may come to grasp the truth of our social order. Others worth mentioning are the mass assemblies of people in Spain and elsewhere in Europe, imitating the Egyptians' occupation of Tahrir Square, who meet nightly to discuss politics, to think about the origin of the problems with which they are faced, and to imagine novel solutions to them, the normal ones being of no avail. Capitalism has been around for so many generations now, proving its vitality by displacing or absorbing all other social systems around the globe, that it seems part of nature, irreplaceable. But just as it's only 400 years old at most, its historical limits are visible in its inability to meet the ecological challenges it has produced, to generate enough growth to profitably employ the billions of people accumulating in slums in Africa, South America, and Asia, along with growing numbers in Europe, Japan, and the USA, and to escape the dilemma of dependence on a degree of state participation in economic life that drains money from the private enterprise system. Just as the Great Recession has demonstrated the limits of the means set in place during the last 40 years to contain capitalism's tendency to periodic disaster, it suggests the need finally to take seriously the idea, as the saying goes, that another world is possible. So thank you, and maybe we can have some, I hope we'll have some discussion.
First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I regret that I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, and I look forward to doing so. I'm intrigued by your final comments about possibilities of abandoning capitalism and how the structural conflicts might lead to those possibilities. And your talk reminds me very much of the thinking of people in the Andes, Bolivia, and Peru who have been challenging neoliberalism and are really thinking as societies how to envision a different kind of economy, of course, with conflicts with the so-called capitalists in their own society. But thinking about so-called capitalists raises some questions for your presentation, at least in my mind, and they'd probably be resolved if I had a chance to read your book, so I apologize
Maybe
for
not.
the innocence of them. I think the questions are three. First one, I'm a little confused by what you mean by profit. Your first definition is kind of a surplus value, where you're talking about profit as that which is left over after the workers take home wages. In other words, what produced by workers. But then you very quickly in your presentation dance to notions of profit as accounting sheets. In other words, what is the business reports as profit.
Yes.
And those two things are not the same, as the derivative crisis points out. And then you brought up in your presentation the problems of debt and the problems of this sort of folding over of money on top of money that creates a quantitative reality when there is no substance behind it. And so there's a contradiction there between that which is actually produced by the workers as opposed to that which is reported as profit. And I never was clear in your presentation what you actually meant by profit as a result. Second question has to do with the role of the state. You make that very strong in your argument against the Keynesian models, and yet I'm confused about how the state fits into this, because I think if I were hearing you, I could also make the argument that perhaps the crisis is not one of the state's over-intervention, but rather that we don't have a state that is equivalent to an economy that is extra-national. In other words, when capitalism can move and expand, and there is no regulatory capacity, or as the IMF is reporting today in the papers, that it couldn't even begin to respond to the European crisis, it doesn't have the capital. In other words, we're seeing perhaps a lack of a state to fill, even if it's just that function as guilt, to take the blame for the global economy. We don't have a state that can respond to the global economy. And so I really don't know how the state fits into this, the nation, the state, at a time where your own model is talking about global capitalism.
Yes.
The third question actually, though, goes to the boundaries of global capitalism, the global economy. And here perhaps an anecdote. You very blithely danced between Buenos Aires and New York in one comment, and brought in Sao Paulo, Mexico City, many other places. Well, many of those are places I've lived as an anthropologist and spent quite a lot of time. During the post-housing, or during the housing bust, I was on sabbatical and spent much of that time in the Andes. And I'm delighted to report there was no crisis. And I'm delighted to report that because for most of my life, they have been severe crises. As the old saying goes, when the developed world sneezes, they catch a cold. Well, right now, the developed world has the flu, and is perhaps even moribund, and they're booming. And so there are fascinating things going on, and this really brings into question, I think of the slums of Buenos Aires, or in my case, the slums of Lima, or the slums of Bolivia. They're not pleasant places. And certainly, the latter comments where you talked about death rates going up when people are employed and down when they're unemployed, that presumes people have food. And in the places I'm familiar with, people often did not have food. And so death rates would go up.
Yes, you have very different patterns statistically before serious industrialization. Then you have a completely different
Well, my
structure.
question here, though, has to do with boundaries. Because, yes, we have a global system, but it seems like it's a nuanced system where there are internal boundaries. And how, in other words, I don't get a clear sense for that, because you're using the word global economy, but then there also feels like there's this differentiation where some people are in crisis and other people aren't. Right now, mostly what's going on to us is kind of irrelevant to what's going on in Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, except for those export sectors. Otherwise, it's pretty irrelevant. So those are my 3 questions. Thank you.
Well, those are all extremely good questions. And a measure of how good they are is that they all require extremely complex answers, which I'm going to try to avoid just because it would take a very long time. The easiest one is the first one. And in fact, yes. I mean, part of the problem is that I'm trying to concentrate a long argument into a few words. If you do read my book, you'll see this, but explained. But I tried to make the distinction when I spoke, but it's hard to, obviously it didn't come across. Clearly, I want to differentiate between profit conceived abstractly, and so you brought up the Marxian category of surplus value, and essentially that would be the equivalent concept of what is produced in value terms in excess of what's necessary to reproduce the labor force and means of production. That profit in that sense, that abstract sense, appears concretely in many different forms, as I said. The profit of business profit, taxes, interest, rents, and so forth. Professorial salaries. It appears in many, many ways. In addition to that, there is the phenomenon to which Marx gave the very nice name of fictitious capital, which is to say, the treating of claims to future income as though they were actually sums of value. And of this, the best example would be the way in which in 2008, the top 3 American banks lost in something like 3 weeks all of the profits that they had reported for the previous 5 years. So those profits didn't really exist. They were calculated on the basis of the trading of IOUs, right? So there's really sort of 3. I would make, just to begin with, the distinction between 3 different categories. Profit as appears in people's books, of which a certain amount is simply imaginary, and that's the part which vaporizes in these moments of financial crisis. Then there's profit as the specific category, namely the amount of money that a business gets to keep as opposed to what it has to pay its creditors or what it has to pay to its distributors and so forth. And then profit in, you could say, a more abstract or underlying sense as that which is produced in excess of the amount required to produce it. Does that clarify? The question of the role of the state is a very interesting and important one. Let me just address sort of one facet of the gigantic bundle of issues you raised. It's a very interesting fact about this social system that despite the globalization of capitalism as a business, which is there from the very beginning. The English capitalist economy begins with slave plantations in the Caribbean and with an empire in India. So, globalization is not something which arrived in the 21st century. It's already there in the 17th century. But despite that the internationalism of capitalism, namely, you try to make money wherever you can, that the political form that developed as part of this system was the form of the nation state, right? It's something that really that comes into existence in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. And it's the difficulty of getting beyond the political framework of the nation state, despite many attempts to do so. The desire of world leaders, business leaders, and like you could say, ruling classes to create a League of Nations or the United Nations or some kind of or even a European Union, some kind of overarching administrative units that can function on an international scale have really not worked very well. And it has something to do with the peculiar nature of the business entity as as an independent, privately owned entity, even if on paper there are billions of owners all over the world, still it's, as an entity, it's separate from the economy. And it somehow seems very difficult. That entity has, those entities have not, to have an international governmental system or some kind of international regulative system, you would have to have a much higher degree of concentration, centralization of ownership. There are still, too many corporations, and they have to compete with each other and struggle against each other. And the only tool open to them to do this is the tool of the nation state. So even though an American corporation may produce all of its goods in parts of England, Spain, and China, nonetheless, it has to function politically as and even if it doesn't pay American taxes by parking all its profits, in the Canary Islands, it still has to function as an American economy in order to have a political force that can represent it. And that's, so I would say, if capitalism goes on for another 2,000 years and you end up with 5 corporations, then you may have 5 giant nations. I mean, what's really interesting is that globalization is to a certain extent a misnomer. What we really have had is a regional creation of a few large regions. So what you have is a sort of a European area, you have the North American area, and a kind of East Asian area. And most flows of trade and investment happen within these areas. And in fact, almost all foreign direct investment is still concentrated in the United States and Europe. So there's it's actually, the actual global economic system remains very, very highly localized. Or even in China, where sort of the dynamic part of the economy, the non-state sector of the economy, is just in a few little areas on the periphery, and they are very closely linked to East Asia and to a very small number of foreign direct investors. So, interestingly enough, the idea which people had already in the 18th century, philosophers like Immanuel Kant, capitalism is going to produce a world cosmopolitan culture, and nationality will not be important, and we will have world law, and that hasn't worked out, I think, because capitalism was not able to create sufficiently large economic entities that they could dispense with the existing state system. There just is no. So you can see in Europe, they really, they had the idea that Hitler had this idea, right? The only way to beat America is to have a large enough economic area that we are a power that can compete effectively with the Americans. So he saw in the future, the British are already over. So the future belongs to America. So in order for Germany to remain an economically independent country, we need to have France, and then we need to have more farmland, so go into the Ukraine, and so create a very large area. So they tried to do the same thing after the Second World War in a different way. But because it wasn't done by military conquest, you still have, separate nations. And you can see they really can't hold it together, because the different capitalist interests, the French banks have certain interests which are in conflict with the Greek banks and the German banks and the American banks, and they can't agree. And so each group of businesses has to make use of their national apparatus because there is nothing else. But I think that's a long-winded answer, but I think it's a really fascinating question as to why the perpetual failure of world governance. I think that's, in essence, the answer. The last thing is even more complicated, which is the relation between the global and local, would be another way of putting it. Clearly this is a system in which things, there's an article, things are shifting. The money moves around. So there was an amazing article in the Times about 2 weeks ago. All the young people who are being fired who are losing their finance industry jobs in New York, they're all moving to Brazil. That's where the big money is. Well, it's partly everybody's excited. There's oil. There's investment. Everybody thinks it's going to be the next big thing. So it might even work for a while. And there's the movement of oil, the development of oil resources in that region is going to have an enormous impact. So, I mentioned Buenos Aires. it had a very, it was one of the prime examples of sovereign default on sovereign debt. On the other hand, now they're doing okay. So you could say the economic energy moves from place to place. My main point was to say, we think of there being a kind of clear distinction between, let's say, what used to be called the first world, the developed capitalist countries where everybody's affluent and everything is zipping along. And then there are these other countries that they're developing economies or developing markets. They're poor countries. That's where the poor people are. And these are thought of as though they were quite separate. And I want to argue that A, they're not so separate, and B, in the rich countries are going to experience many of the features that are familiar from poor countries. So, but in different forms. For example, even though all the young financiers are moving to Brazil and taking jobs in Brazilian finance, the favelas are still there. I mean, you have gigantic slums. On the other hand, you have the city of Detroit, where essentially the city is just sort of collapsing into slums as the automobile industry evaporates. So it's not that you have millions of people coming in from the countryside to live in the city. You had all these people, they've been living in the city. Now the city is turning into countryside. So you have a kind of impoverishment of an urban population through a different mechanism, but it's pretty serious. So that's really what I meant. I didn't mean to say, they're always going to be poor in Lima, but but I want to take those places as places where people think, oh yeah, well, that's not going to happen to me. That's those people down there, the third world. But we're moving. I want to say there is a general third worldization of the world. I actually prefer low growth or high growth or low money producing and high money producing countries, because I think that whole vocabulary of first world, second world, third world has become completely meaningless. But does that make more sense? Yeah. No, thank you. These were really great, thought-provoking things. Yes.
I'm actually an economics student here, graduating in the spring. And is your speech going to be online anywhere? Do you have a website or
apparently it is. Yeah,
okay.
They tell me it is.
Okay, great.
So you can memorize it and repeat it to your friends.
Yeah, I know. It was great stuff. Really touched on a lot of things I've been thinking about lately and everything. And so, I guess my question is, you kind of ended your speech there, kind of looking forward to towards a new system. I haven't read any of your books, but I'm going to go out and get them. So
I like that.
You've
My
got some money coming your way.
Too.
Yep. But can you talk about that at all?
Yeah,
what are some of the alternatives to capitalism? Because I mean, I don't say I've given up, but I've realized just lately that it's kind of on its way out. Like
Capitalism.
The system just isn't working.
But see, that's an amazing fact that you said that. This is so unusual. I'm sure that very few of your peers in this university would say that, right? I mean, most Americans wouldn't think of such. Most people in the world wouldn't think of such a thing. It's a very unusual idea, and it's interesting to there are a couple of ways of approaching this. One is to think, if you go back 100 years, there were millions and millions and millions of people who assumed that capitalism would end soon and that we would have another better world. I mean, right? Partly it was the experience of the change to capitalism from pre-capitalist systems. Capitalism is not very old. In the 1860s, when Karl Marx published his book Capital, there were more domestic servants in England than there were industrial workers. You hardly had capitalism even in England, which was the most developed country in the world. So the thing came very fast, and people said, we just got rid of the whole society before us. It's just a matter of just going on to the next one. So the French Revolution gave us capitalism. The next revolution will give us socialism. And then came this, and none of that sort of happened. By the time of the First World War, it turned out that the great, glorious future that humanity was supposed to be advancing towards did not materialize. What we got instead of the glorious future, what we got instead of socialism was World War I. And then we got World War II, 60 million people dead. And then suddenly everything seems to be okay again. There's the boom, and they rebuild the cities, and And by this time, that whole idea that you could have another system, socialism, had pretty much vanished. So most people, I think, just sort of take for granted, as they have in most societies throughout history, that you couldn't have anything different from this. It's just like when the Third Estate met in 1789, nobody even thought that they could have a society without a king. What they wanted was a constitutional monarchy. It didn't occur to them that 3 years later they would be cutting off the head of the king. Right? And even then, they sort of had to go back and try having a king again for 20 years before they finally got rid of the whole thing. So it's very, very hard for people to imagine that the world that they grew up in, which has certain institutions which are so solid and so gigantic, could change. So I take it as a very interesting sign that and I think there are people all over the world who are beginning to ask the question for the first time in 50 years, or maybe first time in 80 years, how would you change the world, or how could you make another world? So it's partly, I think, because, A, it doesn't seem to be working very well. I think capitalism did not deliver for very large numbers of people the constant rising standard of living and constant improvement of ways of life that it was supposed to. And I think the shock of this current breakdown has been really an eye-opener for a lot of people. But also capitalism itself has sort of given up on, you could say it's almost publicly, let me give an example instead of stuttering. Because again, you like this guy, it's a very deep and interesting issue that you raise. Take a concept like too big to fail. We've got to give the banks $700 million. It's too big to fail. $1 billion. It's too. But what does that mean to say that a corporation is too big to fail? Then you're just saying capitalism isn't working anymore. The whole idea of capitalism is you invest your money. If you don't make money, you go out of business. So the minute the government says, no, we can't let you go out of business, right? We, in fact, are going to do something completely anti-capitalist. We are going to take money and give it to you, right, to prop you up when you have been unable to make enough profits to stay in business, right? So there's a kind of public acknowledgement by the authorities that capitalism isn't working. And it's, I gave that figure of 35% of the American economy, and you have similar figures in the rest of the world being government run. But that means capitalism has already been displaced to a large extent. There's sort of less of it. So you could say if you sort of step back into outer space and look down at it, it's sort of on the way out. But the problem is that the people who own it and run it are not going to just sort of let it go. And now they're trying to figure out what to do, because they can see that they can't keep going on expanding the government bailout system. On the other hand, if they don't do that, then they're going to have to deal with massive impoverishment of the population. And people don't like that. They've been afraid of that since 1930. Right? Since the 30s began the program of the government to try to control the effects of economic downturns. And no government has been willing to simply allow the crisis to unfold in a pure, there has been no free market. I mean, the truth is, I was thinking of this when Jeff gave his introductory words. There never has been a free market in the entire history of capitalism. The state was always, how did the slave plantations of the Caribbeans get set up? The British government sent boats, right? So there has never been such a thing as a free market in the entire history of the system, but there has certainly been no free market since 1932. So it doesn't exist. And they, on the other hand, and there's a reason why. If you really had the free market, we would have, 30% unemployment and people dying in the streets. And the people who run the world are afraid of that because they know that people don't like to die in the streets. They even are a little worried about what's going on now. So I think that this is something that we now have to begin. It's never too soon to start, but just like, you're supposed to think about heaven all your life, you should begin thinking, okay, this system is on the way out, so what do I want to replace it with? Well, it's very simple. It's very basic. Again, the world has changed so much. That's why I think we have to do a lot of rethinking, because there was an older idea that basically the basic idea of the 19th century was that, well, the people who do the work, they don't actually sort of need the owners. They can just talk to each other and organize the process of production and distribution. Now that process of production and distribution is so organized that some of the people who do the work are in California, and some of them are in Shanghai, and some of them are in Turin. And the process of organizing a global economy is a new one. In addition, there are other real problems. It's really only since the Second World War that most people have become urban, and that agriculture has been mechanized and so that only about 2% of Americans now provide all the food for Americans. And that's I would say that's just a system that has to be radically revamped. And so the amount of thought that has to be done to think about, to figure out how to undo the ecological disasters, how to reorganize agriculture, how to reorganize the relation between urban life and rural life, and how to deal with and how to sort of relocalize without sacrificing the importance of a global economy. These are going to be very difficult things. But I still think the only basic answer is that, it's almost a logical deduction. The people who currently own the businesses are not going to say, okay, here's how we think we should commit suicide. They're not. You will have to take that property away from them. And then you have to figure out how to use it. So that means the people who actually do the work have to find a way to talk to each other and think about how to organize life on another basis.